This episode is brought to you by our good friends at NFL Sunday Ticket on YouTube TV. I'm sure by now you've all gotten back into your Sunday routines, but they could be even better. With NFL Sunday Ticket and YouTube TV, you get the most live NFL games all in one place, every game, every Sunday. And you can even watch up to 4 different games at once with multi-view, one of my favorite inventions of this decade. It's exactly what you need to catch all the action, make your Sundays more magical. And also, YouTube TV is great. I got it this year. It's awesome. Sign up now at youtube.com/BS. Device and content restrictions apply. Local and national games on YouTube TV. NFL Sunday Ticket for out-of-market games excludes digital-only games.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year and plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Salah. Escape Cancelo. Oh, it's brilliant from Mo Salah. And still, Salah. Oh, sensational! Son had a goal and scored a beauty.
Oh, what a strike from Yuri Tielemans.
De Bruyne. And it is what Martinelli, gorgeous. Still going up. Oh, he's done it again.
And City have won the Premier League.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, EPL Index proudly brings to you the best prediction podcast in the world, A Tad Predictable, with your host, Tiriwa Chanakira.
And we're back. Welcome to another episode of A Tad Predictable, the postseason edition, where we are going through each and every one of the EPL teams for the 24-25 season. It's coming to an end. We've gone and run the gauntlet. We've got a couple of teams left. We're now on the letter T. I guess the back end of the letter S, depending on how you want to call, how you call them, how you want to call them. It's Tottenham Hotspurs. Some might say it's Spurs. Some might say it's Tottenham. Either way, because we've gone in alphabetical order, it would have fit. It would have slid in right after Southampton. So it's worked out in our favor in that way. And obviously it would be just before West Ham. And then we've got Wolves as well, which will be the last team we will be discussing in this series. As I mentioned, we're going through each of the Premier League teams. So if you want to go back and have a listen to some of the other episodes, go back, listen to those, come back, listen to this Tottenham one. Obviously, as the season has gone on, teams have done more and more business. So some of the earlier podcasts was more a future telling type of scenario, assessing what they could be doing. Now this one is more reviewing what they've done and what is probably left still to do, whilst obviously also assessing what happened last season, what they will be hoping to do this season, and what business they needed to do in this transfer window in order to achieve those goals. Now, Tottenham is probably the club I watch the most live, I must admit. I'm a Liverpool fan. I'm sure not a surprise to many of you, but I'm a Liverpool fan, and I do watch Liverpool games when I get a chance to. But Tottenham, just by proximity, and also by the fact that in my household there are Tottenham fans. There is a Tottenham fan in my household. So and we obviously live in London, so it's a lot easier to get to Tottenham games, and I end up going to a fair few Tottenham games just because of as I said, the home situation, the location situation, and everything in between. So I feel like I've got a good grasp on Tottenham. I feel like I understand, obviously, the frustrations that a lot of the fans have with recent history and the inability to get over the line when it comes to a trophy. And obviously, last season, it resulted in them having to bring in yet another new manager, having gone through sort of a carousel of managers in recent history. Big Ange comes in, Ange Postecoglou, and it seemed like he came in with a lot more fanfare in terms of a unity from the fans of okay, let's get behind him. I mean, when they brought in managers like Jose Mourinho or Antonio Conte, it seemed like they were divisive managers. One, because of the playing style, which I think obviously was a big factor in that. Some people just want their teams to play a more attacking, fast-paced style of football, and those managers don't do that. And when you don't play an attacking, exciting style of football that's very easy on the eye, I think you've got a short leash with fans, because they'll only put up with boring football, and I put that in inverted commas. They'll only put up with boring football as long as you're winning. The moment you stop winning, they don't put up with boring football anymore. And whereas if you see some managers who their football maybe is a bit more palatable, a bit more exciting, a bit more fun to watch, they can ride the wave of losses a lot easier than the managers where the fans or majority of fans are not in agreement with the style of play that's there. So with Ange coming in, with the style of football that he likes, with the personality that he's like, he's more in the Jurgen Klopp mold than a Pep Guardiola or a Jose Mourinho mold. So he's kind of that really, like, from the outside looking in, he comes across as very personable, very he takes on board sort of the ethos and the culture of the club, and he tries to embrace that. There's different ways to manage, different styles of managers, different characters in terms of managers have won things throughout their careers. And I don't think it's a slight to say to Pep Guardiola that, he's maybe more mechanical than a Jurgen Klopp. Like a Klopp would wear his heart on his sleeve. And I think Big Ange is more similar to that in terms of wearing his heart on his sleeve than maybe the more calculated approach of a Pep Guardiola. And you could see sort of with the interviews that he had when he first came in, and that's Big Ange I'm talking about now. He was quite endearing. He was quite honest, which I think was a breath of fresh air for Tottenham fans. And he looked more on the positive of things in terms of, okay, if we're not going to get the signings that I want, I'll work with the players that I have. It's not going to be him moaning about the fact that he wasn't backed in a window where he didn't get the players that he wanted. Obviously, he's got aspirations and ambitions and desires in terms of, for example, growing the squad and the squad depth and the quality of the squad. But if that doesn't happen, he's not going to wallow in it. He's just going to crack on with what he does have and get the results and try and get the best out of what he does have. And it seemed like he brought that message across quite well in his press conferences and interviews that he did. So that's sort of the culture that I thought he brought into the club in terms of let's not complain about things. Let's just get our heads down and get to work. Okay. Things might not always be rosy, but we make sure we work at what we can work. We try and control what we can control. That which we can't control, it's out of our hands anyway, type of approach. And it seems like a few of the players who maybe struggled with previous managers, I think like an Yves Bissouma, for example, they seem to be enjoying their football again under Big Ange, opposed to maybe a different style of management from a Conte or a Jose Mourinho. But yeah, so it was a big change for Spurs. I think it was a conflicting change in this sense, and I'll contextualize it in this way. So Spurs, for a couple of seasons, did the whole long-term manager approach. It didn't work out for them in terms of trying to get over the line. Obviously, very unfortunate in losing out in a cup final to Liverpool in the Champions League. So they were very close to winning one of the big ones. Obviously come second the season that Leicester City go and win it. I mean, what are the odds of that? So like they came close a couple of times under Pochettino, and it seemed like it was getting to the point where something had to change. Either Pochettino needed to be fully backed in the way he felt he should have been backed, or they needed to move in a different direction if they weren't going to do that. And it seems like they went in a different direction. Now, the Pochettino project, as I mentioned, was more of a long-term project. Similar to, like, obviously, it will pain Tottenham fans to hear this, but similar to an Arteta type of situation where it's a trust the process type of mentality of, we're not too worried. Obviously, we hope to finish first. We hope to win every trophy. Yes, I get all of that. But are you progressing? Are you progressing year in and year out? And if you can do that, it gets you closer and closer to getting over the hump. And eventually you do get over the hump. And I probably will bring Arsenal up again later in the podcast. I apologize to Spurs fans, but I do think it's one of those bitter pills that you do have to swallow in terms of you'll hear what I have to say, and I hope that you embrace it. It's not a dig or anything like that. I just think there are some similarities there, and you'll get what I mean once I explain the situation. But I'll continue this thread that I'm talking about in terms of, you know, the project that was being done at Spurs. So the long-term project didn't quite work with Pochettino, and it seemed like Tottenham were trying to then go, you know, in a similar route in terms of the long-term project, because as I mentioned, Pochettino, unfortunately, he gets the sack, and then they're thinking, okay, how do we approach this now going forward? And from Pochettino, they end up hiring Jose Mourinho in 2019. Now, with Mourinho, that's more of a short-term approach. Mourinho comes to a club, he has max 3 years there, right? In the first season, maybe he wins the Carabao Cup, because that's usually what he does. He targets the Carabao Cup because it's a shorter tournament in terms of the amount of games you have to play. It's early in the year, so you can get sort of that monkey off your back in terms of, have I won a trophy? You get that monkey off your back, and it helps breed that sort of trophy chasing, trophy winning mentality within the squad very early on, and you can build that platform from there. So go look at Mourinho's history and look how strong he plays in the Carabao Cup and the emphasis he puts on that, because it helps build a platform. Now, they bring him in, right? As I said, you know you're going to get 3 years with Mourinho, max, at best. First year, probably go for the Carabao Cup, you win that. Second year, he's going to be looking to win one of the bigger trophies. By the third year, the players are starting to get sick of him, and there's usually a revolt, and that's when he, you know, heading into the fourth year, he gets fired either during the season of the third year or after that season, shortly after that, because that's just the nature of the beast with him. And if you look at his managerial history, that's kind of how it's tracked. Now, bringing him in, I thought, okay, you're bringing Mourinho in because you want to win a trophy. It's no longer about the long-term project, because Mourinho doesn't do young players. He doesn't do player development. He likes players that are ready now. They know what to do. I give them instructions. They can execute those instructions. They can play the tactical game and I don't have to worry about their level of performance dropping. That's a big thing that I do think, isn't spoken about a lot in terms of young players. You don't want to give them as many tactical responsibilities. You don't want to overload them. You know, you slowly build that up as they get older. And Mourinho doesn't really have the patience for that. And because he knows he's built this reputation of being a manager that people bring in if they want to win trophies. So he doesn't have time to be developing young players. He needs to be executing and getting the most out of, you know, the player, the ready now players. Squeeze that juice, get the most out of them, go win trophies. That's what Jose Mourinho specializes in. And Spurs, as I mentioned, they were at that period where you're looking at a Harry Kane's age, you're looking at a Son's age, you're looking at a Hugo Lloris's age, and you're thinking these are players that are in their prime or, entering the tail ends of their prime. If you're thinking of a Hugo Lloris, for example, what can we get out of the squad? Can we win a trophy from this squad? Let's focus on the short term. We've been a long-term project for a while now under Pochettino. And Mourinho executed, in my opinion. He got them to the Carabao Cup final. And what does Spurs do? What does Levy do? He fires him the week of the Carabao Cup. And I think that goes to I don't know if it's arrogance or what it is, but I believe Levy wants Spurs to be successful because of his fingerprint being on the team. I think when Spurs eventually win a trophy or, I think he wants it to be people saying, oh, Levy did X, Y, and Z to bring this trophy to Spurs. I think the problem for him is with a Mourinho, everyone would have known it was Mourinho that did it. It was in spite of anything that Levy did. Mourinho went and won that trophy for Spurs, and it would have been all about Mourinho and how great he is and winning that trophy. And on top of that, Mourinho is one of those managers who he's not going to mince his words. If he goes into a transfer window and he says, I want X, Y, and Z, and you don't deliver X, Y, and Z, he's going to tell the world, this is what I wanted to do. They didn't do it. This is why we're not performing, or, this is why things are where they are. And I think that scared Levy. I don't think Levy likes that type of honest manager. We saw him clash with Antonio Conte for similar reasons, because, again, similar style of manager who doesn't mince his words. He's very honest about, about how things are happening. So the danger with Mourinho winning the Carabao Cup, I think, in Levy's eyes, in my opinion, is one, it would have been all about Mourinho and nothing to do with Levy. Two, it would have given Mourinho so much power at that club because he would have been the manager that delivered the trophy. You then try and dare not deliver what he wants in the off season coming up. I think that would have been a huge problem for Levy, and I don't think he wanted to face that problem. I don't think he was going to deliver what Mourinho wanted in terms of player personnel in the off season, and knowing that he wasn't going to be able to match Mourinho's ambitions in terms of what he wanted there. And I think he knew that was going to cause problems if Mourinho did win that trophy, because he would have become an untouchable at Spurs. The fans would have goated him, at that point in time, just because of the starvation and how much they would have wanted to win that trophy. So he goes the week before. They inevitably go and lose that game. In my mind, I have no doubt Mourinho goes and wins that, because that's what Mourinho does. He gets to finals and he wins them. That's what Mourinho does. He comes in his first season, he goes and he gets you a trophy, and then he builds from there. As I said, you get 3 seasons at best. Maybe you can stretch it to a 4th, but it rarely goes that far. You get 3 seasons, but you know what you're going to get. You're going to get he gets the most out of the players that are there, the ready now players. And then after he leaves, you're going to have to rebuild, because he's rinsed that club to the max. All the senior players are probably worn out, and you just need to rebuild after him. And that's usually after that 3-year period, as I said, but it's worth it for a lot of clubs because of the trophy haul that he brings with that. You sacrifice one for the other type of thing with him. But yeah, they end up not winning that trophy. Mourinho leaves. Obviously Ryan Mason was in charge of that final. He was the caretaker manager. They head into, the next season with Nuno Espirito Santos. So that means they're going back to sort of the long-term approach, the Pochettino approach, the bringing in a manager that's more patient, that isn't going to kick up a fuss and a storm if the players that he wants, he doesn't, aren't brought in. Because I don't think a Nuno Espirito Santos has that cachet, has that legacy within the league to demand that. Mourinho's been there and done it. He can say whatever the hell he wants. That's just the nature of the beast. He's earned that right. Not so much. Not so much. It's almost like a happy to be there type of situation. wouldn't have expected to be Spurs manager anytime soon. Maybe from an ambitious perspective, from a personal goals perspective, maybe that's there. But from an objective perspective, I don't think he was one of the managers that would have been thought of to come into Spurs and replace Mourinho. But lo and behold, he comes in. As I said, he's probably going to be more of a yes man under Levy, which again is something Levy, I think, prefers, rather than a combative manager like Jose Mourinho. So interestingly, obviously, it goes horribly wrong, unfortunately, for Nuno Espirito Santos. It starts well and then it tails off really, really badly. Now, obviously, the talk of the town was that initially Spurs wanted Conte. His demands were too big for what Spurs were willing to do that summer. Ergo, very similar to the Mourinho situation in terms of they realized we're not going to be able to match what this guy wants. We can't, one, for Mourinho, we have to get rid of. And then for Conte, we can't bring him in. It goes horribly wrong with the long-term approach that they want to do with Nuno. They then have to double back and go with their tails between their legs back to Conte and sort of try and win him over and bring him in and say, okay, we'll match your ambitions. Lo and behold, that seemed to be a lie because they didn't match his ambitions. He, as I mentioned, similar to a Mourinho, is not going to lie about that. He's not going to hold that in. He's going to talk about it. And he did talk about that fact. And obviously it ended up in him losing his job 2 years into that Spurs job. I thought he did well to get Spurs into European football in the season that he came in. And then, as I said, the clashing between him and Levy just doesn't like that type of manager. It seems like it's too combative for him. It gets too real. The curtain gets peeled a little bit too much for his liking, in my opinion. So anyway, Stellini is there as a caretaker for a little bit, and obviously, right, Mason is there as a caretaker as well. But they eventually end up bringing in Ange Postecoglou. He comes in from a very successful time in the Scottish Premier League, and I think it goes back to the long-term approach, doesn't it? It goes back to a manager that's not going to kick up a fuss, that's not going to complain if things don't go his way in terms of the transfer windows and off the pitch stuff. So Levy's probably more comfortable with the big Ange in that sense. I think from a Spurs perspective, obviously it's also the season that they end up losing Harry Kane in the off-season. It ends up being a very, very big turning moment for them, because as long as you got Harry Kane in your team, I think you should be challenging for trophies, or at least you should give him a team that's good enough for him to drag them into finals and winning trophies, because he's that dangerous. He's one of the best strikers in world football. And if you can just surround him with the necessary pieces, then he can go and deliver, hopefully for his sake, he would be thinking he can go and deliver a trophy. Obviously, it's not worked out for him at Spurs, and it seemingly hasn't worked out for him at Bayern Munich yet, but I'm sure that wrong will be corrected very, very soon in the near future. And I'm speaking about next season. But what that does for Big Ange, I think, is it takes a lot of the pressure off. And I think it was good for Ange to come in the season Kane's leaving. And the reason I say that, obviously he would have loved to have Kane staying, but I think Ange coming in went back to the Pochettino approach, the failed Nuno approach of it's a long-term project. It's a trust the process project. It's yes, we want to win things. I appreciate every season, every team goes into it hoping and wanting to win things. But in reality, when you plan these things out, there has to be an element of realism in there as well. Spurs weren't in a position to win anything, objectively speaking. Now, we've seen teams like a Leicester go on a crazy run. We've seen teams win cup tournaments where they're not necessarily the best team or the biggest depth squad team. It happens, right? But from an objective perspective, I think there were far more teams in the Premier League, maybe not a huge amount, but you would certainly think a Man City, a Liverpool, an Arsenal would win things before a Spurs won thing in any of the competitions that Spurs would have been in. If you're saying an FA Cup, Carabao Cup, and then European football, I think there are European teams that would have been ahead of Spurs, despite how bullish English teams are when it comes to European competitions, irrespective of which form it is. We always just assume the English teams are the best teams, which is not always the case. I'm sure that, there were teams within Europe that were a lot more suited to winning and ready to win compared to Spurs in the competitions that they were in, in that time period. But anyway, so Kane leaving, I think, takes that pressure off of a win now situation, because you're not getting a guaranteed 25, 30 goal a season striker, and you're probably going to have to go and try and replace Kane. They don't do that. Instead, they're trying to replace him internally with the Richarlison and Son combo. We saw how that worked out last season. But in terms of the style that he brings in, it was that refreshing, more Spursy type of football where it's a bit more attacking, it's a bit more fluid in terms of attacking speed and tempo and style of play. And I think the Spurs fans appreciated that. And as I said, when a manager is more willing to play that brand of football, that more palatable style of football, there's a bit more leeway for them. So he has that in his favor in terms of the style of play, at least is more pleasing to the eye. The fans are going to be willing to give him more time. 2, he no longer has Harry Kane, which is guaranteed 25, 30 goals a season. And then obviously 3, it's his first season. You got to give him a bit more time than that. Now, the conflict for him is, for Ange, it's his first season. For Spurs fans, it's the umpteenth season where they haven't won a trophy. So there is a bit of a conflict there. I think Ange is a long-term process type manager, so you have to give him time. But Spurs fans feel like they don't have time to give because they've been waiting so long. And that's where the disconnect, there's the danger of the disconnect happening. I hope that Spurs fans give him time. I think a manager like Ange needs minimum 3 years where you tell him, look, you've got 3 years. That gives you 6 windows in which to mold the squad into how you want it to be molded in terms of a player personnel, business perspective, players coming in, players going out. Okay. I think those 6 windows, 3 years gives you enough time to get rid of the players you don't really like, bring in your type of players, and then not just bring in your type of players, but implement the style of football that you want from those players. Yes, you can do and probably this is the big issue with Chelsea. Yes, you can try and sign an entire squad in one season, but there's still the implementation that needs to take place. You still need to bed in the style of football and how you want to play. Look at how long it took Klopp. Yes, Klopp got to a European final in his first season with Liverpool, but it took them a while before they really started to play like a Klopp-style team. It's going to take Spurs a while, not forever, not an extended period of time. As I said, the 3-year threshold is plenty of time to get them to start playing in a way that he wants them to be playing, where it's not even a situation where they have to overthink decisions on the pitch. It just comes like second nature. Everyone knows what everyone's going to be from a shape perspective, from a runs perspective. I know the type of runs you're going to make in the system that we're playing. I know if I press here that this player is going to be, following me, and it creates a pressing chain. Those type of things will obviously improve and become better the longer that he's there and the longer that the players that he wants to be playing play together. And you can't underestimate that. It's so important having that trust, having that knowledge, having that confidence in your team, in that not only that I know what I'm doing, but I'm confident that everyone else in the team knows what they're doing. That makes a huge, huge difference in the fluidity of a team, especially if you're a team that wants to play fast-paced football. We've already seen Spurs starting to get, that identity. We've seen Ant start to implement that identity. Those back post crosses in transition, Spurs love it. Low crosses to the back post in transition. Spurs will score many, many goals from that. They did last season. They will continue this season. We've obviously seen the high line. It helps having the pace of a Mickey van der Ven there to sweep up anything that goes in behind. Obviously they need to fix their set pieces. That's a big issue for them, but you can start to see what Ange is trying to do at Spurs, and it's going to be a mixture of the players getting used to it and him being allowed to bring in the players that he thinks can execute that job. As I said, 3 years minimum. For Spurs fans, that's probably not what you want to hear. You want to be challenging like yesterday. I get it. I appreciate it. I understand where you're coming from, but he's just not that type of manager. If you want to do a compete now thing, you have to go back to a Mourinho. You have to go back to a Antonio Conte. And it seems like Spurs fans didn't like that approach. So you have to then embrace this longer term approach. And the reason why I was saying I was going to tie Arsenal into this, and forgive me, Spurs fans, for doing this, but it's the same thing. Arteta, you look at his first couple of seasons at Arsenal, woeful in the league. Not good enough for, in inverted commas, where Arsenal should be. And again, this whole where a team should be, you earn your right to be in a certain position in the Premier League. But anyway, where Arsenal should be. They didn't do well in the league for a couple of seasons, but they saw the signs of improvement. And that is the key thing. And it's, we've seen it from Liverpool, for example. First couple of seasons with Klopp. Yes, in the cup, they got to the European Cup final, but in the league, it was a progression thing. Year by year, they were improving their league position. You could see what style he was trying to implement. You could see the growing pains, but you could see that there was a future. You could see that there was promise at the end of the tunnel. As I said, we've seen it from a Klopp, we've seen it from an Arteta, we're seeing it from Big Ange. You have to be patient with that type of approach, because at the end of the day, what you have to ask when it comes to whether Big Ange is the right person at Spurs is, are we improving? Can you see improvement? Can you see how the squad is improving? Can you see how the squad is growing? The moment the squad stops growing from a developmental perspective, from improving their league performances perspective, that's when you start looking at whether or not to fire him. It's not whether or not you make top four. It's not whether or not you win a trophy with him. It's, are we progressing year in and year out? And at the end of the day, after you keep, if that keeps going, if you keep improving year on year on year on year, you will inevitably eventually get to that promised land. You will eventually get that trophy. You will eventually be back in a title challenge, and be competitive in the league from that perspective. As long as you're seeing that progression, and it is actually a progression that is happening, it will get there. That's how you have to assess it. Don't worry about whether or not he's made European football. And I know that's a difficult thing to say because fans want that. You want the results nowadays. Like there's no patience when it comes to managers. Did we make top four? Did we win a trophy? Are we challenging for things? Would you rather have an FA Cup or Champions League football? Those type of conversations. To me, I think that's a short-term approach. I understand why fans have that approach, but I think it would be better if Spurs as a club, this goes from top to bottom, including the fans, had the approach of, we're trying to improve year on year, and we're all going to get behind the idea of, until we see that he's, the squad is not improving, we're going to back this manager fully, and we're going to trust that at the end of this process, it's going to lead to success. Now, in saying that, obviously, there's a whole host of things that do happen in and around trying to achieve that. And whether or not Big Ange is the person that can get that holy grail, can get Spurs to the promised land, we will see. I'm hoping for their sake that he is. It appears as though he's making the right moves and stuff like that to try and improve the squad and build them from a developmental perspective. Last season, they were running hot. We saw it. And then obviously they suffered a lot of injuries. That's probably a big concern for me in terms of the amount of injuries that Spurs faced last season. I'm going to pin that down to it's his first year. It was Ange's first year with these players, trying to figure out the sports science side of things, trying to figure out the fitness side of things, and hopefully they adapt that this season. So you're not having, obviously playing style is a huge thing. As I mentioned, for example, with Mickey van der Ven, my big fear for Spurs is, yes, the approach is we're going to have a high line because we know he can sweep at the back. If he's doing that 500 times a game, you're going to break him. You are going to break him. And if he keeps getting a lot of these injuries, he'll then lose that speed. He'll then lose that asset, that the good things about him because of the level of injuries that he's having and the volume of injuries he's having. So there's a delicate balancing act there. They need to get better at managing their squad from a fitness perspective, from a sports science perspective, in my opinion. But let's look at last season, what happened, and then we'll move on to, going into this season and what they've done in the window and what's left. But I did feel like I needed to set the table to contextualize what I feel Spurs' situation is, where I think Spurs are in this current version of Spurs, the patience that they need to have. It's very difficult. I keep saying that because I live it every day. I know it's difficult for Spurs fans to hear that word patience, but I do implore them to be patient and trust that this will be a fruitful way to go about things. But anyway, in the league, they end up finishing fifth. Unfortunately for them, this time around, it wasn't enough for Champions League. Obviously, England were one of the teams that could have potentially had an extra spot. That fifth spot could have been that extra spot to win Champions League football. Alas, it wasn't. I think that's a blessing in disguise for Spurs. I don't know if heading into next season, they had the squad depth to compete in the Champions League. Again, yes, I know every fan, everyone wants to be in the Champions League, but sometimes it's more of a detriment being in the Champions League when your team's not ready to be in the Champions League. And I know it hurts hearing that, but that's the reality of the situation. I've been there from a Liverpool perspective where I got a lot of backlash for saying this at the time, but there was a time when Liverpool weren't good enough to be in the Champions League. They didn't have the squad depth to be in the Champions League. I preferred them being in Europa League because there was a better chance of player progression towards what we were trying to achieve, which was establishing a squad that was good enough to compete for the league. If you're stretching the squad too thin during a Champions League campaign because you don't have the squad depth, it's going to hurt you in the long term. It's going to hurt your league form. It's going to hurt your European football form because you're not going to be good enough to go and win the Champions League. It's the same situation for Spurs. They're not good enough to go and win the Champions League this coming year. Rather be in the Europa League and be competitive and try and go and win that. It also allows you to focus on the Premier League because you can rotate a bit more in the Europa League than you would be allowed to in the Champions League because you wouldn't be able to get away with that because of how competitive it is up there. So from my perspective, it's a blessing in disguise. I know for Spurs fans, they don't want to hear that. They want to be competing in the most competitive tournaments, in the biggest tournaments year in, year out. I appreciate that. But anyway, they end up finishing fifth in the league. Probably feel unfortunate that, they miss out on Champions League by 2 points. But I do think Aston Villa over the course of the season thoroughly deserved that fourth spot. And I'm excited to see what they do next season. Again, another squad that I think maybe the Champions League came a season too early for them, but they've gone big in the transfer window and tried to address that. We'll see how they pan out from that perspective. But anyway, in terms of the FA Cup, right, they go in the third round as all Premier League teams do. And I know Spurs fans, it was a big thing for them. They thought either the Carabao Cup or the FA Cup, we're going to go and target that. We're going to go and win one of those at least. Unfortunately for them, yes, they won 1-0 against Burnley, but then they come up against Man City. I mean, eventual finalists. It's always difficult when you get drawn against Man City in these cup competitions because of the squad depth. Man City can rotate their whole squad and still have a squad that could challenge for European football in the Premier League. That's just the way it is. So it was unfortunate for them from that perspective. They end up losing 1-0 to Man City, as I said, unfortunately for them, lack of the draw. Carabao Cup, they were one and done. They came in the second round and lost to Fulham on penalties. We ended up seeing that Fulham had a decent campaign in the Carabao Cup last season. Obviously ended up losing to eventual winners Liverpool. But in hindsight, okay, they lost to a team that went deep in the competition. It's not as bad. But obviously at the time, it's unacceptable from Spurs fans' perspective to be losing to a Fulham so early in the Carabao Cup, especially when they know how starved they are for trophies and how much they want to. I think it was a learning experience for Ange in terms of how to manage the cup competitions and the league. Fortunately for him, maybe not fortunately for Spurs fans, but fortunately for Ange, they didn't have European football, because I think it would have gone a lot worse in the league if they had European football as well. But I think he got a taste of the demands of the cup football in the Premier League, trying to juggle that with being competitive in the Premier League as well. As I said, one and done in the Carabao Cup. I know a lot of Spurs fans wanted a stronger team to play in the Carabao Cup and focus on that. So we'll see how Ange approaches it this coming season with the addition of European competition as well. That will be interesting. But yeah, so not a very good season for Spurs from that perspective, in terms of it's another season where they didn't win a trophy. They didn't go deep in any of the cup competitions. And then they obviously still end up missing out on Champions League football, despite, some of the teams in and around them, or all of the teams in and around them. Most of the teams in and around them had European football to contend with, as well as league, where Spurs, if you look at, they were out of the Carabao Cup in the first round, so they could focus on the league for a good long while. They were out in the FA Cup 2 rounds in, so again could focus on the league. Probably disappointed that they didn't do a little bit better in the league. But let's take a quick break. Hopefully Spurs fans will come back after the short break, because I know it seems like I've been harsh, but I promise you, I think this is good medicine. I think this is the approach that would be most successful for Spurs if they embrace it, of this long-term, going back to the long-term approach of trusting the process, of allowing a manager to build and mold the squad in his image, and then starting to judge him on whether or not he's winning trophies after he's had a chance to, put everything together and have the team gel and used to playing his style of football. But guys, I must mention that this podcast is presented by EPLindex.com in association with our presenting sponsors, Liberty Shield. Liberty Shield is a VPN provider. You can check out their services at libertyshield.com. If you use the coupon code EPL25, you get 25% off of the router or the software VPN, and we thank them for sponsoring this show. But as I said, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll jump into this coming season. What are the aspirations? What has Spurs done so far in the window, and what maybe they still need to do in order to achieve their goals? We'll be right back after this short break. All right, we are back. We're talking Spurs. I went in to contextualize my feelings on Spurs. I thought I needed to get that off my chest when it came to them, but now it's time to focus. We've drawn a line in the sand here. It's now trying to focus on the future. What can we expect from Spurs going forward? In terms of aspirations for this coming season, back in European competition, obviously, I think the important thing for them is getting back into the Champions League. Now, obviously, the ultimate route, the way you want to do it, is in the Premier League. And how you start approaching that is first and foremost looking at the teams that finished above you and saying, looking at the teams that finished below you and saying, can they catch up to us? We've seen the likes of Chelsea have a big summer. We've seen Newcastle be able to retain a lot of the talent that maybe people thought they might lose after not qualifying for European football. We know Man United is always going to try and improve things in the off season from the transfer window. Whether or not that's always the right personnel that they choose, that's a different conversation for another day. And you can definitely go listen to my Man United podcast that I did a couple of weeks back on them. But I do think from a transfer perspective, the teams below Spurs have tried a lot to close the gap with the teams that were above Spurs in terms of we're trying to address it off the pitch in terms of transfers Now it's whether or not they can coach up those players that they've brought in. They can, continue developing the players that they do have. I think that's probably been the sticking point for a lot of those teams. And Man United, for example, always spend big in transfer windows, don't always get it right when it comes to a coaching and a tactical perspective. Chelsea, we've seen it season after season, especially in this Todd Bowley era. They just spend like it's like money's running out, in the next day or so. They're just insane with the amount of players that they bring in. So they're just trying to flood the team with new signings and hope that works out. I don't know if the new manager is good enough to handle all of that, and we will see whether or not he can. Obviously Newcastle, they will have continuity in terms of same manager, a lot of the players they've retained that they wanted to retain, maybe one or two additional additions to come in later on. So Spurs are in the mold of sort of the opposite of Man United. Yes, they will spend money, but it's not going to be the big Man United splashy type signings, but the emphasis is going to be on coaching and developing players and looking to improve that way. Whereas a Man United approach is more looking to improve from the players we bring in rather than necessarily from the coaching perspective. I think that's just been in their DNA for a couple of years now. Now, obviously, I say that knowing that Spurs spent big on Dominic Solanke, but again, Dominic Solanke, yes, the fee for him is quite a lot. 60 odd million, including add-ons or excluding add-ons, depending on who you listen to. But 60 odd million is a lot of money for maybe a striker who, yes, he was really good last season, but is he world class? Is he approaching that conversation for world class? I don't think he's approaching the conversation. He's certainly not world class in my opinion. I don't think he's approaching that conversation yet. I think there's a level of consistency that needs to be had before you start entering that conversation. And if he can maintain what he did last season, okay, now we're starting to see something. Now we can maybe start to listen to people that would make the argument that he's world class. Maybe not agree with it, but at least listen to their points. So it's a big move. It's brave from a Spurs perspective, because if you're going to spend that type of money, people are expecting a certain standard and level of performance and output. And for Dominic Solanke, it's a big move. He's been at a big club before. Well, he's been at two big clubs. He was at Chelsea and then he was at Liverpool. Didn't quite work out for him at those clubs. Gone to Bournemouth, did really well to rebuild himself and earned himself a big move like this. And again, just because it didn't work for him at Chelsea or at Liverpool doesn't mean it's not going to work for him at Spurs. And we'll see whether or not it does. In terms of stylistically, I like the fact that he can stretch teams and he can come short to play. So he's got that overall play. He can play on the shoulder and try and, beat the offside track and trap and run in behind. Or he can play with his back to goal, who's quite strong and try and bring players in. I think that's going to suit Spurs, having that versatility from him. And obviously him being very clinical is going to be key to everything that they do this season. So that's Dominic Solanke in. I think maybe Spurs could have gotten a bigger name for the money that they spent. But in terms of his season last season, I think it's a comparable player, and I think they're going to be happy with the player that they've brought in. Now it's about whether or not they can execute from that perspective, from him trying to be the main man at Spurs. In terms of other signings that they've made, Archie Gray comes in, super talented young player. Obviously, they had Phillips come in last season. They've got Archie Gray coming in this season. This approach of bringing in super talented players, young players from the Championship, I think is a smart play for Spurs, because these are players that you can develop them. And when you've got a manager like a Big Ange who's big on coaching and development, I think it's smart bringing in these players that can be developed, and whether they become mainstays in your team going into the future, or you eventually sell them, I think you're going to make quite a lot of money for the club. And look, I do believe Archie Gray is a smart signing. I think he is someone who, the key thing for them is going to be figuring out where he's best suited to be playing. We've seen him play at right back. We've seen him play centre midfield. We've basically seen him play everywhere on the pitch for Leeds. So the task for Spurs is nurturing him and growing him into a specific designated position, whichever they feel is his best position, and helping him grow as a player and developing in that position. So he's one to keep an eye on. I think it's a long-term investment. I don't think it would be fair for them to throw him into, serious minutes now, so early into his career. I understand at Leeds he had a big role to play there, but I do think at Spurs they need to be careful with nurturing him and bringing him and developing him slowly and surely to ensure that they can enjoy him for an extended period of time, not these flash in the pan type young players that come in and then by the time they're 26, 27, they're burnt out. So hopefully they protect him and nurture him really well. As I said, for his age group, I think he's one of the more talented players. So it's exciting for Spurs if you're a fan of theirs and you brought him in. He's not going to be alone in terms of young 18-year-old centre mid signing, because Lucas Bergvall comes in as well. Super talented player. Again, another super talented player for his age group. Another player who I think Spurs have to slowly develop and be careful with. But with a manager like Ange, who is big on the coaching side of things, on developing players, I think he's the right manager to be bringing in these type of young, exciting players. They obviously brought in Min-Woo Yang as well, South Korean player. So it will be interesting to see how he develops on the pitch. So yeah, he's more of a winger than a central midfielder, but we'll see how he develops and hopefully he does well. But in terms of those are kind of the big signings. I think the impact for one for this season is Dominic Solanke. Spurs needed a forward, I believe, heading into this summer. I don't think the Richarlison experience has worked for the long term in terms of if you think he's going to be the one starting and leading the line. I think he's great as a depth piece up front. He's great as a depth piece for all the front three positions, if you want to call it that. But I don't think he's a leading striker for a team that would be challenging for a league title or going to win multiple trophies in a season, in my opinion. And obviously he had his purple patch last season where he seemed to keep scoring and scoring and scoring, but I don't think he can deliver the 25, 30 goal season. I think Solanke has the potential to. I think we saw it last season. It's now about consistency and whether he can do that season after season. And he's entering that time of his career, 26 years old, where we start looking at your consistency and we start looking at, can you put an entire season together rather than, purple patches throughout the course of the season, running hot and cold. Let's get it more even keel. Let's get you contributing in big games and hopefully that works out for them there. So yeah, that's it in terms of incomings. In terms of outgoings, obviously further incomes, it's more to do with loans. Jed Spence is back at the club. He's had some minutes in preseason. Emerson Royale has been let go. So obviously that creates a space for a Jed Spence, for example. So we'll see whether or not he continues to develop. Obviously, maybe not the favorite of previous managers that were there, but hopefully it's a new start for him with Ange at the helm, and we'll see whether or not he develops. But I'm assuming them selling an Emerson Royale, who I don't think suited the style of play that the manager wanted to play. I think that shows that a Jed Spence or whoever else can step in there. They feel they've got enough cover from a right back perspective, because if Porro goes down, and at least they've got a player that is more adventurous going forward, so slightly more similar to a Porro than what an Emerson Royale is, who is sort of in the Wan-Bissaka mold of better defensively than they are going forward. So yeah, so he obviously comes back and maybe will have a bigger role. They did well in terms of clearing a lot of I know people like to call it dead wood, but they there were a lot of players at Spurs, the Joe Rodens, for example, the Ryan Sessegnons, the Tanguy Ndombeles, who were there on bigger contracts than they probably should have been, which is why it was really hard to get rid of them. And Spurs have had to bite the bullet on a few of them. Ndombele, for example, they basically had to pay him off to leave. Sessegnon, he's left on a free transfer. Perisic is left on a free transfer. I feel sorry for Jaffa Tanganga. He's left. I thought maybe he could have been a squad piece for them, but he's gone. Emil Højbjerg, again, a player that I think can be a decent squad player, but maybe it's a fresh era under Ange and he just doesn't quite fit or tick all the boxes that Ange would want. So maybe it was better off them sending him out on loan to Marseille. But yeah, that will be interesting to see how he goes on and whether or not his career continues elsewhere. But it appears as though it will. Obviously, the likes of Eric Dyer, who were pretty much already out of the club, they've now officially gone. So yeah, a lot of players who Spurs fans have spoken about in the past as players they should be selling in order to raise money. But it's interesting that they've sold them or let them go, and not a lot of money has come in for those players. A lot of them Spurs basically have to pay off to leave, but at least it clears that deck. It clears some of the wages, although in inverted commas, does it really clear the wages if you had to pay the player off? But anyway, that's too deep a conversation for right now, and I don't think I have the time to go into that. But the players are off, or they're no longer at Spurs. Let me put it that way. They're no longer at Spurs, and they're looking to move forward. So what can they do this season? I think European football, they'll try and be really competitive. I think it's going to be a very strong competition. And yes, they might be one of the teams that's spoken about as favorites, but I do think it would be quite an achievement if they do go and win the Europa League. I think there's some strong European teams in there this season. In terms of the Carabao Cup and the FA Cup, you hope that Ange has learned some lessons from last season and approaches it differently. But again, it's now an added competition in the Europa League. So does that sway things? He didn't have that last year and he still struggled in those cups. So I think if it was me, and I'm not a Spurs fan, I don't have the issue of the patience and being, impatient when it comes to the trophies type of things. And I do get that and I appreciate that. If I'm Spurs, the focus would be on having a good league campaign. Can we get a good league campaign this season where it results in Champions League football? And then next season, same thing. Can we repeat that? I would want 2 solid seasons where they get Champions League football. It's now established fact that Spurs are a Champions League team. Then you go and chase the trophies. Because but at that point, you've had 2 seasons of being in the Champions League, which would give you 2 seasons of decent transfer windows where you can go after players that know you're in the Champions League. So you can improve, the pool that you're shopping in. And we know for a Spurs, for example, they can't just go and buy the best player. Spurs can't do that. I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. There's too much competition because all the best players, other clubs are going to want them. Spurs have to be smarter with the way they sign players, or they have to go and sign a Dominic Solanke, for example, who, again, talented player, but not going to be at the top of the shopping list for some of the bigger teams in Europe, let alone in the Premier League. That's just the nature of the beast. But if you can bring those players in, a Dom Solanke, for example, who's shown potential, you've got a manager that's good at coaching players up, and he can develop a Dominic Solanke into whoever insert player that you want here that's ready-made now. Okay, can we develop him into an Osimhen, for example? Some may say it can be done. Some may say it's impossible to do that. But that's that's the pool that Spurs are shopping in. The players that aren't quite there yet, but are showing signs that they could get there if they develop and max up their potential. And then you're now trusting the manager to do his job, which is to coach these players up to that level. 2 seasons of Champions League, of top 4 in the Premier League or top 5, however you want to look at it, in the Premier League, where they make Champions League and then we start looking at trophies. But I know for Spurs fans, and I hope for their sake, that this season they go on a big cup run that leads to them winning a cup tournament. I don't think they're going to be in the conversation for the league title this season, not as things stand, in my opinion. And obviously we'll see how the rest of the transfer window goes, but I just don't think they have the squad depth to do it. I don't think they have the consistency to do it. And I'll end the podcast with this. What's up with James Maddison? Has his confidence taken a knock by not being involved in the England squad? I was hoping he would come back and this would be a prove-it season for him. This would be a screw you season for him, an angry James Maddison season, where he's trying to stick it to Gareth Southgate and his staff for not bringing him, not backing him, not thinking he should have been one of those non-negotiable players that goes to Europe with England. That's what I was hoping to see out of him. I've not seen that yet. Maybe when the season starts, we'll see it, but I've not seen that yet, and that worries me. I need him to have a chip on his shoulder. I need him to come into the season aggressive and ready to prove everyone wrong and leave no doubt that he should be in the next England squad in whatever tournament they're in. Hopefully for Spurs fans, that's the James Maddison that comes in, not this still having a hangover from last season's performances Maddison that I've seen in pre-season. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. That's going to do it for another episode of A Tad Predictable. Guys, go and check out EPLindex.com. There's all the news that you guys could wish for during this last bit of the transfer window. There'll be obviously previews for the first game week of the Premier League season that's coming up. If you want to catch up on what's happened in pre-season with teams, you can go check the articles on that at EPLindex.com. There's the transfer daily updates that happen. Those come in video form as well. So go and subscribe to EPL Index on YouTube. Tap the bell for notifications, and then you'll just get those daily transfer updates every single day. And, it's a good summary. If you don't want to have to click through millions of articles from various different sources and websites, you can just listen to that podcast. It gives you a summary of what's going on in the transfer world from an English Premier League perspective. Guys, go and subscribe to EPL Index on your podcast providers. Give us 5 stars, write positive comments. That stuff really does help us out. Go follow at EPL Index on Twitter. Go follow at A Tad Predictable on Twitter. I've been to the Ochinekera. You can find me on the Twitter handle at Tad Predicts. Huge thanks to Obi Semenya. He's at John Empire SA, and Jody, she's at Spursy141 for our guest intros. Our producer behind the glass, Mr. Guy Drinkle. He's at Guy Drinkle on Twitter. From Guy, from the team, and myself, remember, Chizinga Perry, Chino Shura.
And still, Salah, oh, sensational! Son had a goal and scored a beauty!
Oh, what a strike from Yuri Tielemans!
De Bruyne! And it is Wood-Prowse, Martinelli, gorgeous! Still going up! Oh, he's done it again!
And City have won the Premier League!
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.